So we're going to start off by talking about each of these, and we're going to start with a group of slides that really has got space, intensity, and age. I'm going to throw it over now to Jim.
Thanks, Jay. Our first chart looks at space versus enrollment growth. And as you can see, contrary to what a lot of people think, we've actually been building less space than we've been growing enrollment. There was a very rapid period of growth in enrollment from 2007 to 2012, over 10%, while we grew space at a rate of around 6%. In the last year, we're beginning to start seeing in 12 and 13 now, last couple of years, a leveling off of that growth, and I'm going to show you in a minute by type of institution. So while that growth curve was going up very rapidly, and we were building additional space, but not at the same rate as growth, it means campuses have gotten somewhat more dense because we've added more students, but not so much space. But that's beginning to level off. When we break this down by type of institution, we see an interesting picture. Only one of the three types of institutions that we tracked here, research institutions, continue to see that growth curve growing up even as of 2013. We've seen no leveling of research institutions, in part because I think many of them are a desired institution within their region or within their state, and they offer a lot of programs, and in many cases now, because of the shrinking numbers of students, it might be many students are looking towards research institutions and have the possibility of attending school there. Comprehensive institutions had a very similar growth curve to the research institutions up until about 2012, and now we've seen not only a leveling but a slight decline in comprehensive institutions of all kinds. These include public and private. And our small institutions, which are primarily private institutions, you're seeing that enrollment decline hit starting around 2011, and it's continued in 2012 and 2013. What's also interesting is the small institutions are the only institutions now which are growing space faster than they're growing enrollment. In part because of increased competition, these campuses have increased some of their residential space, they've increased some of their student life space, they've increased some of their science and research type of space to attract students, but right now that growth curve is not there in terms of the enrollment. So these are some of the effects of the declining enrollment. We expect to be watching this very carefully over the next few years as enrollment declines continue out until about 2018, 19, 20, when they will kind of level off nationally. When we look at public versus private, you can see that the public institutions still growing. Private institutions actually started leveling off around 2011. Our database is split about 50-50 here, so we've got lots of institutions in each of these. And you can see the enrollment growth, though, is pretty similar. The space growth is pretty similar between these two types of institutions. One of the things that we're tracking very carefully is the aging campus. This graph looks at the amount of space under 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, and over 50, both public and private, and the national averages, and looks at this based on renovation age. So we have reset the clock on any building that has been, where at least 50% of the replacement value has been addressed in a group of projects that are resetting the clock on mechanical systems within that particular building. And you can see from the national standpoint, there's been some shrinkage in the 25 to 50 category, but primarily because of the shift over to the 50 to 100. So it's not necessarily making progress, it's just the amount of space under 25 and over 25 stayed pretty much the same over the last 4 or 5 years, up a little bit since 2007. Similar story on the public and the private side. The difference is that public institutions tend to have a lot of space in that 25 to 50 age category. Many of these institutions grew very rapidly in the 60s and 70s, and now those buildings are the ones that are causing a lot of issues, and they have a very high concentration of space in those age categories. The private tends to be a little bit mixed. Many of the private campuses that we have are older campuses. Many of them are in the Northeast. They were ones that were built you had buildings built 100 years ago. Many of those buildings still exist, have been renovated, but many of them still are facing renewal cycles, and they're over 50 years old. But the overall story here is that the progress on the aging campuses, despite some significant investment of dollars that did level off after, as Jay pointed out, after the recession, but there's still been significant capital investment. But we've not been able to reset the clock that much on these spaces over since 2007. One of the reasons for that is this waves of construction. Jay mentioned this earlier. This tracks all of the buildings that we have and all of the space we have on our entire database, about 1.3 billion square feet, and looks at the year in which the building was originally constructed. So we go all the way back to 1880, which is our oldest building on our database. And when we take a look at this, you can see that about 40% of all of the square footage was built from about 1951 to 1975, what we call kind of that post-war era. Much of that space was lower quality construction. It was being built very fast to deal with the veterans that are coming back from the war and the baby boom generation that came in the 60s and 70s. And you can see that that is all the space that is causing a lot of people the issues around deferred maintenance. Many of these buildings have not been renovated, as we just showed on the last slide, and as a result, they are past due. At least one life cycle is past due, and many of them are approaching 50 years old. Will all approach 50 years old in the next decade. Then there's a complex era from around 1991 to currently, which is what we call about 27% of the space. Kind of the complex buildings. Many of these have very high numbers of air exchanges. Many of them are LEED certified buildings. They are more technically complex. And if you think about the terms that Sightlines uses on catch-up versus keep-up, you might want to think about that post-war 40% as the heavily catch-up era buildings, the complex area of buildings, the complex space, your keep-up. And what we're finding is that essentially there's just not enough money to go around to deal with this catch-up and keep-up. And you can see that there's no other time in the history of space that we've had both of these types of challenges hitting us at the same time. Another factor that we've been tracking, and this was not in the paper, but we've kind of added this to this webinar, and that is we've been tracking academic versus non-academic space. And there are really only 2 times since 1880 where academic and non-academic space came close to being 50-50. One was around 1960. And this is the percent of space built in that particular year. So around 1960, it was about 50-50 in terms of academic versus non-academic space. Sort of makes sense because the non-academic space was essentially residential and student life space that was being built for a growing population of baby boomers coming to college. And now, around 2000, in the current era, we're getting very close back to that 50-50 time, starting in around 2010, where we've got a lot more non-academic space being built. In part, this is colleges and universities responding to demands of students for recreational facilities, growth in the athletic programs, which would be non-academic, as well as some of this are these 1960s dorms coming due and people replacing that space with new, more modern suite-style dorms and other type of new, modern living quarters. But it's interesting to see that, you know, even as back in the 1940s, 1950s, 70% of the space being built was academic. Now it tends to be non-academic as well as academic space, and that's, I think, affecting some decision making on campus as we take a look at the space profile. So Jay, that's sort of the picture on space and age and density, and I think we have a question around this.
Yes, Jim. We actually received a question yesterday during the registration process that fits right in here. The audience member asked if you could better define the concept of renovation age versus construction age, and I think you've already done that for the most part, but if you wanted to elaborate on that at all, that would be helpful. But they also wanted to see the concept of renovation age seemed to resonate with them as sort of a top-down indicator of, you know, capital requirements ongoing. I'm wondering if you could give an example of an institution or a group of institutions that kind of use that as a way to guide investment.
Right. Well, Well, you remember this slide just from a few slides ago when we showed the national, public, and private average renovation age. And as I pointed out, renovation age is at least 50% of the replacement value of a building has been replaced in a project. So it means that the clock has been reset on the mechanical systems of that particular building. So it's functioning more like a modern building, not like a building when it was constructed. As we can see, there's been a very little progress if you were to look at the blue and the red compared to the yellow and the black. Essentially, the percentage of under 25 and over 25 space stayed relatively constant since 2007. Been slight improvement, but really almost no improvement since 2009, since the recession hit. I want to show you a state system that we work with, one of our 18 state systems we work with, where they've actually been able to reset that clock. And take a look at what they've done. They've set policies within the system and within the campuses to target buildings that are in that 25 to 50 age category, knowing that they're poorly constructed, knowing that they need renewal, and recognizing that in some cases they need replacement. And in fact, in this particular state, they had a policy of renovation through replacement. That is, they would encourage campuses to knock a 1950s and 60s building down and replace it with a brand new building. And as a result, through both academic and residential, academic and non-academic space, they've gone from 59% in 2003, from the 25 to 50 era, down to 32% in 2013. And they did it without letting a lot of buildings cross over into that over 50 age category. You can see that the over 50 category in 2003 was 13%. It's now 14%. Their peer campuses, as you can see, have made slight improvement in improving the under 25 space, but mostly the changes in the yellow occur because the black is growing from 16 to 21%. So this system, through its policies and practices and incentives that they've created, financial incentives, have really made a difference. And back in 2003, you can see that they had under 30% of their space, 28% of space under 25. They're now up to 54% of their space under 25. So much better balance in their age profile and less renewal needs coming down.